Cool. All right. So this is how we kind of start. We have this Docker container, or this Docker file, and it just like imports from Python. We set the working directory to app. Remember that will like both create this app folder and then cd into it. Set an environmental variable, copy these files, which all it does is just a very simple Flask application. Run our requirements.txt and then call Flask run. Right. So there's like kind of bare bones Docker image. Here we have our Docker file. Do Docker build -t. Let's call this Flask web app dot. Right. Dot is the build context. Build it. So just as a way to like review command, right, and then we can compare it with exec. So what command does is, remember, command is like the only line here that's not going to be saved in our image, right? Command's going to be run when we actually run the image, right, or run the container. So you can see that here, right, where like this is an image, working directory app. This is an image, right, layer 3 or 4, or not in an image, but a layer in an image. So this is a layer, is importing this Python environment. This is a layer changing the working directory. This is a layer copying it. This is a layer, and then we're done, right? We're never actually, at this point yet, calling this last line. So then as we know, right, so with Flask, when we call Docker run, that's when finally we're going to be kind of like at runtime executing the command, okay? And then the other thing we know about command is just that what we're specifying is default behavior, okay? So in other words, we don't have to run this when we boot up the container. Like we can choose to override it, right? I can just do like list the contents, right? I'm going to override Flask run with ls and just decide, okay, I'm going to list the contents now instead, and that occurs. So, so just like for command, just things to remember about it is one, run at runtime, not at when building the image. 2, we can override the command at runtime. Flask run image name, and then like ls or whatever you want to put here is going to override this. So there's a similar kind of like Docker function, and that's entry point, but it works slightly differently. Okay, so let's start to see how this will be fine. Actually, we'll do this. We'll do this. Entry point Flask run. So we're going to rebuild the image. And now we can run it. So we're going to run it, and entry point's similar. Notice that like when I built the image, it's not talking about anything in entry point, right? That's not there. It's only when we do Docker run does this line actually executed. So it's the same thing, it's running on the port, it's getting executed. So with entry point, it's similar in the sense that it's run at runtime, not when building the image. But here's the difference that you can start to see. With command, you have this is just a default behavior, but you can override it. With entry point, this has to be run. Okay? Like let's try to override it. So if I do Docker run Flask web app ls, it's actually going to throw an error. And the error it gets thrown is got an unexpected argument ls. So why does this happen? The reason why is because anything you provide here is actually, it's not overriding what's specified in entry point. Instead, it's just tacked on as an extra argument to what's in entry point. So this ls is basically as if we're doing Flask run ls here, right? And then it's seeing that, it's like trying to do that, and it's saying that makes no sense that you're providing me with Flask run ls, right? Notice that's different than right with command. when we did docker run flask app ls, it just overwrote this whole thing and replaced it with ls. Here it's just tacking it on as an argument. So you can take advantage of this. Like you can still do, like if you want to, now that we're using entry point, you can do docker run flask web app, and then I can like send arguments. You know, I can say like, let's say the port to be like 3000, and this argument will go here, right? Flask run port 3000, and you can see that it's set the port, right? That's like a nice little thing. All right, so what's next? So when do you use entry point? You oftentimes use it with like setups type stuff for your Flask application that you don't want to be ignored. So for example, you might set up, use entry point to be like, let's create the database. You know, like you can run a create database or create your tables and seed your database, right? That way that's always occurring. And then if you run Flask, like that's great. If you if you just bash into the the Linux your container, you still have those tables and those that data seeded. So it's like I always want this to occur, right? So let's kind of see that. We can mock it for right now. So what I'm gonna do is I'll say like echo, let's say just like create database. So I'm just we're not actually doing this. We're just gonna like mock it. And we're going to say, okay, like I always want the database to be created. For that is going to be an entry point. And then remember, what we could do is we could do this like, this actually won't work, but it's a good thought, is to like always do this, right? Always set up my environment. And then, by default, run Flask. But I can override this to like run bash or ls or something like that. So that would be the idea. Okay, so let's build this, and then we can run it. And I wonder if anyone can kind of see the issue we're going to run into. So we're going to run this. Yeah, and you can kind of see what happened. So what happened is this create database is running, right? It has to run, right? And you can see that create database, and that's coming from the entry point, echo create database. But then this Flask run, we want this to be a separate command, but instead what's happening is what command is doing is it's providing this as default arguments to this, all right? So like you could, again, how could we use this properly? Like we could do this, we could like in a different setup, do like Flask run, and then command would be like -- port equals 80. And so what's happening is we're always going to run Flask, and then by default we'll set the port to 80, right? And we can always override that. Let's just do that real fast, and then we'll go back to doing this. How do we like seed the database, etc. So here I'm doing entry point. I'm always going to run Flask run. And then this is my default, right, is to run it on port 80. And as we know, this argument in command is basically going to get kind of tacked onto this right here. So now I'm going to do docker run Flask web app. And this should run on port 80, right? And there you see it, right? It's running on port 80. And kind of the nice thing about this is, Flask run, this is always happening, and then I can override. This is the default behavior, but I can override it, right? I can do -- port equals 3000, and that part's going to get overridden. All right, cool. Okay, so let's go back to that previous example now, where what we were trying to do was like this echo create database, and then maybe like provide like a separate kind of, we always want this to occur, and then our default behavior is a second kind of step, which is to then run Flask. It looks like we have a question, so let me see. Why couldn't we create a database in run pip install in a run function? Yeah, you can do that, but here's the thing. You don't want, this is a good question. So Conwall's asking like, why can't I just do this? Run, create the database. And here's kind of why, right? If you think about it, remember all these steps are in your image, right? If it's not entry point or command, when are these things getting executed? They're getting executed when you're building your image, okay? But something like creating the database, seeding the database, creating the tables, like when do I want to do that? Probably when I'm building the image, like probably when I'm building up that container. Why? Because, well, I don't even know if I'm going to have like a database like that's up and running. When I'm building this image, I may want to change the database, right? Like each time I build the container, sometimes I want the database connecting locally, other times I want it connected to RDS, right? So I don't want this just like running once and kind of like packaged up. Like I don't even know kind of how this would be packaged up. Like my database isn't in the image. So that isn't going to really work, right? Instead, what we want is, we want this at runtime to occur. So that's why we do want entry point probably if we want this to always occur and to occur at runtime. Okay, but what we can't do is we can't do entry point comma Flask run because that's going to just tack this on as an extra, right, as an extra argument and not execute as a separate command. Okay. So here's what typically you'll do. What we could do, by the way, like we could do like an ampersand, but that will run into, like, in other words, remember in Bash, you can do like echo, hello world, and then do like and like ls, right, where we're doing 2 lines here. But it's not a great idea because like you don't want these and things to get super long and like there can be a lot of setup. So instead, what we'll do is we'll create a file called like setup.sh, okay, and we'll put this setup work into that file. Okay, so let's just move. I want to like just kind of explore the setup.sh thing for a little while. So what we'll do is we'll do echo create database, and you can imagine like echo like seed the database. We'll just say like create the tables. And then seed the tables, okay? And if you run this, right, basically this just works just like Bash. Anything that you provide here, you can just do sh. Where is that file? It's in setup.sh. I can just do sh, setup.sh, and it runs what we have here, okay? So then the next thing we can do is we can just like copy. We can really just move this if we want. We can just move this, not move the Docker file, sorry. Move setup.sh into app, into this folder, and so that would be copied into my Docker image, right? And then for entry point, I can do sh setup.sh. And now we need kind of one more thing. We need still the ability to like separately execute this command. So how will that work, right? So right now all we're doing is we're just kind of like when Docker boots up, when we boot up the container, I want to run sh setup.sh. So sh setup.sh. Where is it? Did I move it? I moved into source. So sh setup.sh, and there's kind of one more thing we can do which is going to help. So we can add this line, which I probably will forget. It's execute $@ I believe, and I'll show you what this does. So now if I do let's actually add one more thing. We'll do echo bye everyone. Okay, so now look at what's happening. We're creating the tables, we're seeding the tables, and then we're doing this echo bye everyone. Or I can do sh setup.sh ls. And now look what's happening. We're creating the tables, we're seeding the tables, and now we're listing the contents. So what we just did was we added a third line. So we have this initial setup, right, of create the tables, seed the tables, and then we have this other line that basically says execute the following. command. And this can be anything. Like we could just do execute, like echo command, create more tables. And that will create more tables. It will execute this command, create more tables. But what we're doing here is we're saying this $@ says, okay, take what you pass through. Take what you pass through here, and we can reference this argument as this $@ okay? So now this is actually going to kind of complete our puzzle. So let's kind of think about how that's true. Because now what we can do is we can copy over the file, right? It's in the source directory. We copy it over this setup.sh. This is going to do our initial setup, right? When we do entry point sh.sh, .setup.sh. And remember what this command does. This, in this context, is going to tack it on to up here. So it's basically like we're doing this. Flask, run, right? If we do that, that's pretty good, right? I can show you. If I do sh setup.sh flask run, that should call that, right? It will create the tables, see the tables, and then execute the flask run command. So that works for us. Okay, that's the whole thing. So let's do it, and then we can review. Let's just build this thing, and then we can review this whole thing. So docker build -t, I forgot what I called it. Flask web app. So we'll build it. Oops, there's no Docker file. I need a CD out here. Okay, so we're building this. Notice still we're, copying, we're installing the requirements. I probably should have reversed the order of this to take advantage of caching. That's a very small detail. But we're not doing either the entry point stuff or the command stuff, right? Because it's at build time. Then at runtime, we'll do docker run flask web app. That will take these as default arguments, flask run, pass it into sh setup.sh. These arguments will basically be caught by this line down here. So when we call this sh setup.sh, that will run these two lines and then run what we pass through as an argument. By default, we're passing through flask run. But remember, we can always override this, right? So by default, we'll do docker run. That will create the tables, see the tables, then call flask run, because that's what's done by default. However, we can also, replace it with ls. So now it's running setup.sh, overriding this part with ls, and then that's what's getting passed through here to be executed. All right. So just to review, I just want to review kind of what we covered. So the first thing is, command. We know it occurs at runtime, not when building the image. We can override the command at runtime by just providing an additional argument. Entry point works basically the same way, run at runtime, not when building the image. The difference is you cannot override the command. You can only provide additional arguments to it. So what that means is if you don't have this command, you can, when you're Docker running it, provide additional arguments, right? And it's going to get tacked on here. If you do have the command, this will be the default additional arguments tacked on to entry point, right? But they can still be overridden just by you providing your own. And then we take advantage of this setup.sh kind of for two reasons. One reason is this setup is going to grow, it can get longer. We can create the tables, we can see the tables. You may also want to at runtime wait until the database has set up or keep retrying, right? You can listen for certain kind of things to be ready and then see the data, tables. Then, so you can imagine this file like getting longer. You might want to like move folders around or set permissions, or like things like that. Um, so here we are. So that's one reason why we're moving it over to here. The other reason is we're taking advantage of this part where like this argument here is going to be executed as a separate command, whereas previously it would be executed. If I just did like echo hello world, it would just be tacked on as additional arguments to that echo command, right? So because we have this exec thing, where exec is able to reference what we pass through to setup.sh, right? We can run this part here as an additional command. All right, now let me look at the questions. Okay, will we talk about all of this in the context of Docker Compose? Like we would provide a unique setup.sh for each Docker file in the directory context of the relative. Yeah, well, you would do that. You would provide a unique setup.sh for each kind of like separate Docker application. And even though, even without Docker Compose, that's true. Like in this lab, we're going to have we won't use Docker Compose, but we'll have separate Docker containers, right? One for the backend Flask app and one for the front end Streamlit app. And each of them will have their own kind of like kickoff command and potentially their own setup.sh file. Other question, hold on. Second question, how can we use argparse with a library in Python? Like my Python scripts has some args like source table. How would I use entry point when I'm running my Docker image? Yeah, that is a good point. That's a good question, David. So David's kind of like pointing out so the same way that you can, when I'm doing setup.sh, right, we can take these arguments here and run them over here, right? Like kind of catch them as this $sign here. In Python, you can do the same thing, where you if you have Python, like index.py, you can do say you have you can take certain arguments. You can, if you do Python 3 index.py, you can pass through arguments here. I'm not going to do it on the spot because I don't know how. But you can pass through certain arguments and then catch them in your file with this argparse thing. So how do you do that with Docker? I don't know that you could do it probably, but you just have to figure it out. I'd have to come up with a good example. I'm not really prepared for that now, but that's a good point. So there is an equivalent, kind of as David's point, in Python where you can pass through command line arguments and catch them with this argparse library in Python. And then I think we may have had one more question. Yeah, so Scobie, points out asks, how does entry point and command compare or differ with the run command? Conwell, you want to answer that one? This was your question. I normally don't put people on the spot.
No, it's okay. I think that you already mentioned that this happens, whatever is mentioned in the run, that eventually happens during the building of the image. So whatever installation you do, that eventually happens in the image you build, versus what you mentioned in the entry point or CMD, that happens during the execution of the running of the image eventually at your EC2.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's everything here happens when you do Docker build, right? This is at build time. Anything that has run, or anything up here. Entry point or command, this happens when I do Docker run, right? So you could see that, when we do, if you just, if you do Docker build -t, web app sh dot, right? You'll see the stages, step 1, step 2, working directory, step 3, step 4, run. Any of the run commands, they're going to happen when you're building the image. But what's skipped when you do Docker run this thing, that's going to happen when you build the container, right? Like at runtime. So certain things you want to happen at runtime, right? Like kind of we talked about, like doing the database setup, maybe changing some permissions, like you may want to recreate the database each time and then seed it, with updated data, or you could use a volume, etc. But like, that you want to have occur each time, because it's like you create it when you're, I don't know, creating it when the image is, that's not really like, you want to be able to swap out the database. It feels kind of hidden to me. Like somehow this thing got created like a week ago when we built the image, and now like that changed the database. That feels, not right. Okay, you can also have multiple run commands. Exactly. So Kyle says, you can have multiple run commands, but I assume, and he assumes correctly, you can only have one entry point in one command. So you cannot do this. You cannot have like entry point. This doesn't work. You only get one per Docker image. Same thing here. You only get one command, right? And even when you do entry point and command, kind of as this is not giving you two separate commands, right? These guys are provided as arguments. The only way to get like additional commands at runtime, right, is by doing this sh /sh, setup.sh, running this script, or you could do like what I showed you with the ampersand thing, okay, to like run multiple things in one line. All right, so that's what I wanted to talk about. I know it is pretty detailed, but when you're getting to this level, you need, like, that's what you run into, right? It like you're gonna run into a lot of these like detailed things that you just need to have working. By the way, and I should maybe point out, like I did just see